taken me months to gather the courage to write this. I never thought I'd be the kind of person sharing something so personal on the internet, but maybe someone out there needs to hear this, like I wish I had. My name's Jake, 36, and I've been married to my wife, Emily, for 12 years. We have 2 kids, Ava, 8, and Lucas, 5. From the outside, we were the typical suburban family. Soccer games, birthday parties, family barbecues. But inside, I was falling apart. It started subtly about 2 years ago. Life got predictable. Emily and I were in a routine: work, kids, chores, sleep, repeat. We still loved each other, but the spark felt like a distant memory. She was often exhausted from managing the house and kids while juggling her job as a teacher. I was overwhelmed by my demanding sales job, feeling trapped by the endless grind. Then came the guilt. I started noticing other women. Not just noticing: lingering stares, wandering thoughts. Coworkers, strangers at coffee shops, even friends of friends on social media. It felt disgusting, but I couldn't stop. They seemed exciting, unattainable, untouched by the exhaustion that defined my reality. One night after a long, stressful day at work, I went out with some colleagues. There was a new hire, Megan, 28, confident, funny, carefree. We talked a bit too much, laughed a bit too hard. Nothing inappropriate happened, but I could feel something shift inside me. Driving home that night, I hated myself. I knew I was playing with fire. The worst moment came a few weeks later. It was a rainy Friday evening. Emily was drained after wrangling the kids all day. She barely acknowledged me when I came home, just asked me to take out the trash. Her voice was flat, emotionless. Something inside me snapped. I went to the garage, sat in my car, and broke down. I cried like I hadn't in years. Gut-wrenching, painful sobs. I felt like a failure. A lousy husband. A distant father. A selfish man chasing fantasies. I stayed in that car for over an hour, wondering how I'd let things get so bad. For months, I hid it all. I buried myself in work, tried to be present with the kids, but at night, I'd lie awake, consumed by guilt and resentment. I was angry at myself, at Emily, at the life we'd built that now felt like a trap. Then one quiet Sunday afternoon, I couldn't hold it in anymore. Emily and I were folding laundry in the bedroom, a painfully ordinary moment. I turned to her and said, "We need to talk." She must have heard something in my voice because she sat down, eyes wide with concern. I confessed everything. How disconnected I felt. How I'd been noticing other women. How I hated myself for it. I expected her to cry, scream, maybe even leave. But she didn't. Instead, she took a shaky breath and said, "I've felt the same way about us." That moment was the turning point. We didn't fix everything overnight. Far from it. We went to marriage counseling, something I'd scoffed at before. We learned how to communicate, really communicate. We had painful conversations about unmet needs, forgotten dreams, and how life had worn us down. I realized how much I'd taken Emily for granted. How she felt unseen, unloved, stuck in a cycle of survival. She admitted she'd been emotionally checked out too, feeling like she was raising the kids alone while I drowned in work. We made changes. Real ones. We set aside weekly date nights, even if it was just Netflix and takeout after the kids were asleep. We divided household responsibilities more evenly. I learned to listen without trying to fix everything. She learned to express her needs without assuming I should just know. The hardest part was forgiving myself. Emily had already forgiven me, not because she was weak, but because she believed in us. She saw the good in me even when I couldn't. It's been over a year since that night in the bedroom. We're not perfect, but we're solid. I still notice attractive women sometimes. I'm human. But now I recognize those thoughts for what they are. Fleeting distractions, not solutions. Emily and I have built something deeper than what we had before. It's not just love. It's partnership, understanding, resilience. If you're in a dark place in your relationship, please know that change is possible. If both people are willing to fight for it. We fought, and we won. Life didn't magically transform after we decided to work on it. The hardest part came in the months that followed. when the emotional high of our breakthrough faded and reality came crashing back in. The first few counseling sessions were brutal. We sat on opposite ends of the couch like strangers. Emily cried through most of them, finally giving voice to all the things she'd kept bottled up. How lonely she felt, how she'd lost her sense of self, how she worried I didn't love her anymore. Hearing her say those words shattered me. I thought she was the one holding everything together. I never realized she felt like she was barely hanging on. Our counselor, Dr. Peters, was a calm but firm guide. She didn't let us escape into blaming each other or rehashing old fights. Instead, she made us confront what we wanted our marriage to be. Not what it was, but what it could be if we rebuilt it from the ground up. One session hit me particularly hard. Dr. Peters asked us to write letters to each other, explaining what we missed most about our early relationship. Emily's letter destroyed me. She wrote about how she missed the way I used to look at her, like she was the most important thing in the world. How I'd text her randomly during the day just to say I loved her. How I used to pull her in close while we were watching TV, like I couldn't get enough of her. I missed that too. More than I'd admitted, even to myself. The next few months were about small changes, not grand gestures. I realized I didn't need to win her back with some over-the-top romantic move. I needed to show up every day, in the little ways that matter. I started leaving notes for her on the bathroom mirror. Simple things like, "You're doing amazing. I see how hard you're working, and I love you." I made breakfast on weekends so she could sleep in. I texted her during the day, even if it was just a silly meme or a random thinking of you. She did the same. She started asking about my work again, something she'd stopped doing when she thought I didn't want to share. She planned a surprise weekend trip to a quiet cabin when she knew I needed to unplug. For the first time in years, we were putting each other first, not just as parents, but as partners. But it wasn't all progress. We had setbacks too, arguments where old resentments surfaced, nights when exhaustion made us snap at each other. One night, after a particularly rough fight, I ended up on the couch. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I felt that familiar voice creep in. What if this is just how it's going to be? But then, something different happened. Around midnight, Emily came out of the bedroom, wrapped in a blanket, eyes still puffy from crying. "Come back to bed," she whispered. "We'll figure it out." One of the biggest lessons we learned was that love isn't a feeling you have. It's a choice you make. Every day, over and over. I used to think falling out of love just happened. That you woke up one day and realized you were too far gone. But that night on the couch, I realized love is something you have to fight for, especially when it feels like you're losing. We kept showing up through fights, through tough conversations, through moments of doubt. We learned how to apologize without keeping score, how to forgive without holding grudges. We rediscovered the things we loved about each other. And we built something new. It's been almost 2 years since that breakdown in the garage, the night I thought I'd ruined everything. Looking back, I'm grateful for that moment, as painful as it was. It forced me to confront the truth, that I wasn't the husband I wanted to be, but I still could be. Emily and I aren't perfect. No marriage is, but we're closer now than we've ever been. Not because we fixed each other, but because we chose each other, again and again. The other night, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Emily playfully threw a dish towel at me and laughed. I grabbed her by the waist and pulled her close, the way I used to when we were dating. For the first time in a long time, I saw that familiar spark in her eyes, the one I thought we'd lost. "I love you," she whispered. "I never stopped," I replied. And this time, I really believed. Life after that felt different. Not easier, but real. Emily and I had torn down the walls we'd built between us, but rebuilding took time. There were still nights when exhaustion hit us like a freight train, and moments when the old patterns crept back in, me getting lost in work, her feeling like she was managing the house alone. But something had changed. We were aware now, and that awareness made all the difference. One night stands out in my memory like a snapshot from a film. It was late summer, and the kids were asleep after a chaotic evening of backyard games and sticky s'mores. Emily and I were sitting on the porch swing, sharing a bottle of cheap wine we'd found in the back of the pantry. The air was warm and still, filled with the hum of crickets and distant laughter from a neighbor's barbecue. Emily leaned her head on my shoulder, something she hadn't done in what felt like forever. We didn't talk much, we didn't need to. The silence between us felt comforting, not strained. Out of nowhere, she said softly, "I was so scared you were going to leave." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I turned toward her, gently cupping her face. "I was scared too," I admitted. "But I was never going to leave. I just didn't know how to fix it." She smiled through watery eyes. "I'm glad we didn't give up." So was I. The hard parts no one talks about. Marriage isn't like the movies. There's no dramatic ending where everything is magically perfect. Some days we still fall into old habits, snapping over silly things, getting caught in the chaos of work and kids. But now we recognize it faster. We don't let resentment simmer like we used to. One of the hardest lessons I learned was that being tempted by others isn't what destroys a marriage. It's the distance you allow to grow between you and your partner. That distance was what made me start noticing other women in the first place. Not because I didn't love Emily, but because I felt disconnected, unseen, stuck in a life that felt more like surviving than living. Once we closed that gap, those wandering thoughts lost their power. They weren't about wanting someone else. They were about avoiding the emptiness I felt at home. Fixing that meant facing the uncomfortable truths about our relationship and, more importantly, myself. The turning point. One particularly tough week stands out. Work was insane, the kids were going through a rough patch, and Emily and I hadn't had a proper conversation in days. I felt that old voice creeping back. "You're failing. It's too hard." But instead of shutting down, I did something different. I texted Emily from work, "Hey, I know we've both been running on fumes. I miss you. Let's do something together. Just us." She replied almost instantly, "I miss you too. Let's have a porch date tonight after the kids are in bed." That night, we sat outside with blankets and hot cocoa, just talking about nothing and everything. It wasn't some grand romantic gesture. It was intentional. We showed up for each other, even when life felt overwhelming. That's the kind of love I never understood before. Where we are now. It's been over 2 years since I sat crying alone in that garage, thinking I'd lost everything. And now, I feel closer to Emily than I did when we first fell in love. Not because we went back to how things used to be, but because we built something new, something stronger. We still do our weekly date nights, even if it's just pizza on the living room floor after the kids are asleep. We take turns planning little surprises for each other, like leaving sticky notes on the bathroom mirror or sneaking each other's favorite snacks into the grocery cart. They seem small, but those things matter. They remind us we're still choosing each other. Every day. A few months ago, Emily surprised me with a scrapbook she'd been working on secretly. It was filled with photos from our entire relationship. Our wedding day, the kids' first birthdays, vacations, even silly candid shots of us laughing at stupid jokes. At the very end, she'd written, "We've been through hell and back, and I'd still choose you every time. I don't cry easily, but that broke me in the best way." Final thoughts. If you're struggling in your relationship, if you feel like you've lost something you can't get back, know this, you're not alone. Marriage isn't always easy, but it's worth fighting for if you're both willing to show up, even when it's messy and hard. You don't need grand romantic gestures or a perfect life. You need honesty, vulnerability, and the courage to admit when you've messed up, and the grace to forgive, even when it's not easy. I almost lost everything because I was too scared to be honest, with myself, with Emily. But facing the darkness is what saved us. Love isn't a perfect fairy tale. It's showing up, over and over, through every setback and every triumph. And I'm still showing up, for her, for us, for me, every single day. Vi skazali. Carry on of the final. Programa ChatGPT skazala. Where we are today. It's strange looking back now. If you told me 2 years ago that Emily and I would be closer, happier, and more in love than ever, I wouldn't have believed you. Back then, I thought rekindling the spark meant sweeping her off her feet with some grand romantic gesture. A vacation, an expensive piece of jewelry, a dramatic apology speech straight out of a rom-com. Turns out it wasn't about any of that. It was about showing up in the smallest, most consistent ways, choosing each other daily, even when it was hard or inconvenient. One quiet moment that changed everything. Last month, we were sitting on the back porch again, our favorite place these days, sharing a bottle of wine after another chaotic family dinner. The kids had finally gone to bed, and the house was still. We didn't have anything special planned. It was just one of those quiet nights where everything felt right. At one point, Emily leaned against me and whispered, "Do you ever think about how close we came to losing this?" Her voice wasn't sad, just reflective, like she was marveling at how far we'd come. I thought about that awful night in the garage, about all the hard conversations, the counseling sessions, the late-night apologies, the tears, the doubts. I think about it all the time, I admitted. But I'm glad we went through it. She smiled. Me too. What we've learned. If there's one thing our journey has taught me, it's that love isn't about avoiding hard times. It's about facing them together. It's about being brave enough to admit when you're struggling, even if it terrifies you. I used to think falling out of love was inevitable, that time and routine would slowly erode what we had. But now I know love doesn't fade unless you let it. It needs attention, not in some dramatic, movie-worthy way, but in the everyday, mundane moments. A lingering hug after a long day. A shared inside joke that makes you both laugh until you can't breathe. A random, "I'm thinking of you," text during a boring work meeting. A late-night conversation on the porch about dreams you thought you'd forgotten. We still have fights. We still get tired and stressed. But now, there's this unshakable foundation beneath it all. This understanding that no matter how messy life gets, we'll choose each other again. Why I'm sharing this. I know some people reading this might be in that dark place I was in, feeling trapped, disconnected, maybe even considering walking away. If that's you, I want you to know something. It's not too late. It won't be easy. It won't be quick. It might be the hardest thing you've ever done. But if both of you are willing to put in the work, to be vulnerable, to face your fears, to choose each other every single day, you can rebuild something stronger than you ever thought possible. It's not about being perfect. It's about being real. About admitting when you've messed up and learning how to forgive yourself and each other. The future we're building. Emily and I still talk about the future, but now we dream in together terms again. We've started planning a big trip with the kids next summer. A cross-country road trip. Something we'd always talked about but never actually did. We're even talking about renewing our vows for our 15th anniversary. Not because we need to, but because we want to. It feels right, like a celebration of everything we've survived and built together. I can't tell you what the future holds. No one can. But I know one thing for sure, whatever comes next, we'll face it together. And this time, that feels like enough. TLDR. My marriage almost fell apart because I let distance and resentment build between my wife and me. I noticed other women and felt like my relationship was beyond saving. But instead of giving up, we faced the hard truths, went to counseling, and rebuilt our marriage piece by piece. Love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing each other, even when it's hard. We did. And we're still choosing each other every day.